This is where the Alabama Book Festival takes place. You may walk down the street to the Ware Harley Hood House to go to a wedding reception, or in the other direction to the Young House to attend some fabulous dinner. This is what old Alabama town looked like in the 1970s. And you may wonder how it got to look like it does today. But wonder no more, I'm going to tell you. We're just right around the corner, and I hope most of you have been there. But if not, what you'll see when you go around the corner is a lovely grouping of historical structures and buildings that tell the story of Montgomery's history. But how did it get there and why? Well, I'm going to take you back just a little bit. 1853 exactly. And this was when the Mount Vernon's Ladies Association formed a group to save George Washington's home. And this was a time when Americans were placing a value on architectural elements as a way to talk about local history and to learn from it, their local history and their national history. And some of the places they turned into shrines, like Mount Vernon, but other places, like old Alabama town, they just used the buildings as more of a reflection of what the ideals and the aspirations and what the people at the time and place were dealing with. And so it was that this was happening in Alabama also. And with the women that formed a group to try to save the first White House of the Confederacy met with much success. And so the home was restored, and it's very beautiful, and it's still here today. Then moving on into the 1960s, that's when the federal government instituted the Historic Preservation Act. And at the same time, interstates were coming through. We have 65 and 85 here, tearing up our neighborhoods and really messing with the cityscapes. And so historic preservation got a lot of people rallying around it at that time. The Alabama legislature passed a law in the 60s as well that affected our cities and municipalities. And it stated that they could form organizations or groups to protect these historic sites and historic buildings. And so the Montgomery County Commission then created the Montgomery Historical Development Committee and also the Architectural Review Board. So the following year, Horace Perry, who was the city attorney at the time, said that we should create an organization called Landmarks Foundation of Montgomery. And its mission was going to be to preserve, interpret, and protect the history and the architecture and culture of Montgomery. So how do you do that? Well, around the country, house museums were gaining popularity. And right around the corner, at Hull Street in Jefferson, the Ordeman Shaw House was available for sale. This is a beautiful Italianate house. It was constructed, or the plans were Italianate in style. And Charles Ordeman, who was a German-born architect, and his wife Sarah moved into the house next door while this house was being built. It's a beautiful house, two-story, and in the back are slave quarters. There is a detached brick building, and in the slave quarters are where the meals were prepared, and upstairs is where the servants and the slaves would sleep. So in 1854, the house was beautiful and it was completed, but the Ordemans ran out of money and they never got to live there. They had to sell the house in 1854, and they sold it for $3,200 to the Mitchell family. The Mitchell family was from Mount Meigs. They lived in the house for about 4 years, and then they sold it to Erastus Jones. And Mr. Jones was a physician and a pharmacist, and he lived in the house for quite a while and sold it in 1905 for $4,000 to the Shaw family. So they stayed in the house for quite a while until Landmarks Foundation purchased the house from them. And the house was purchased with the city of Montgomery and also with HUD funds. And after it was purchased, this was 1967, and I'm sorry, it looks like we cut off Jimmy Loeb's head in this photograph because you know Jimmy Loeb was there. He was our founding president, board member, and really the chutzpah behind this big movement. So the house was purchased in '67, and much meticulous research and restoration begun. And Today, the house opened in 1967, and today it's furnished in much the period as it would have looked in the 1850s for a middle-class family living in Montgomery. Here are the slave quarters. You can see the kitchen area on the bottom floor, and the right-hand top picture is the sleeping area. There are 2 rooms like that upstairs. And I've got a picture of this group that came to visit us 2 years ago during Black History Month. The 2 gentlemen kneeling in the front are from the Slave Dwelling Project. And they go around the country trying to raise the visibility of slave dwellings that maybe have fallen off the map and need some recognition. And he had been to Old Alabama Town before, and he had this group of students from Florida State University that he wanted to kind of induct into his line of thought. And so they were going to come and spend the night at the slave dwellings. And this was February. It was rather cold. Of course, there's no heat in the ornament house. So they had a fire going that night, and they were telling stories of what the slave life would have been like. And of course, the whole point was to impress upon these kids with the night of staying in a slave dwelling, what it was like. But so many of them got freaked out by the stories that they were too scared to stay in the house, and they slept in their cars. Anyway, so history goes. So, let's see if we can get those. All right, so we've got the Ornament Shaw House, and it's on its original site. And it served as the nucleus for the development of the rest of Old Alabama Town. And over the next several decades, the structures grew to 50, and they were on over 5 city blocks. Most of the buildings were moved from around this downtown, and some of them were from out in the country that came into Old Alabama Town for safekeeping. The museum buildings are of a great variety, and we've divided them up into 2 sections. We have the living block and the working block. And the living block is where people used to gather. We have a school there, a grocery store, we have the church, and then on the working block, we have the blacksmith shop, and we have the potter's house, and the spinners and the weavers, and we also have the fabulous cotton gin. So this was done with a great deal of effort, as you can imagine, to get all these buildings here. Montgomery must have really been excited about history to get these buildings here. And I know Joan probably has a million stories she could tell, but just let me give you an inkling of what it took to get these houses here. I'll start with the Rose House. This house was in Elmore County. It's an 1840s house. And the first thing you have to do is find the house, and then you have to document it. And then comes the deconstruction, where you take apart as much as you can so you can load it up on some type of wheels to get it to go down small country roads or through the interstate system, and then finally into downtown Montgomery, where the city had to move telephone lines or change the traffic signals. And then you have to unload it onto its perfect spot at Old Alabama Town and start reassembling it. Okay, so it's a picture of a house getting reassembled. So what I was going to show you, and it may pop up in a minute, is a series of slides that our curator put together. Go fast, okay. This is the Moulton House, and this house, you can see, is moving through downtown Montgomery. It's huge, it's 2 stories. And there's Marion Neely, she's on the front of that truck over there. She and Jimmy Lowe were up to their necks in this. And here's the Moulton House today. It serves as the administrative office space for Jenny Weller Catering. We leased it to them. They just moved in that last year. This is the Thompson Mansion. And this has quite a story behind it. When this house went up for auction, apparently we lost the bidding on it, and a gentleman who purchased it took it apart limb by limb, numbered each board, and stored it in his barn. After several years, he decided, well, I'm not going to do anything with this, and he called up Landmarks Foundation and said, do y'all still want it? We said, yeah. And so they put it back together, and here it is. And you might recognize it. At one time, It was the Welcome Center, the Visitor Center for the city of Montgomery. It sits at the corner of Hull and Madison. And we lease it right now to Brown Studio Architects for office space. Okay, and here we go again. This was happening at a pretty, 1 or 2 houses a year. This is Lucas Tavern from Wong, 1818. It also has the distinction of having Lafayette spend the night there on one of his travels through town. This is it today. It serves as the entrance to the living block in the museum part of Old Alabama Town. And here's the Young House. And this, I love this building. This is a very small building. This is the doctor's office. And this was the office of Dr. Thomas David Duncan. He went to medical school at the Medical College of Alabama in Mobile. He graduated in 1892. And when he graduated, he put this little house on his parents' land and opened up shop. And this is where he mixed his medicines and stored his surgical implements. And took care of his neighbors in this farming area. And a couple of weeks ago, we had a young man come in. He was touring with his 4th grade class, and the tour guide was telling him about how rough life was in the country in the 1850s and all the horrible diseases that were there. And he showed him the implements you see on the left. Those are not tongue depressors; they're really tongue clinchers. They used to grab your tongue with this metal thing and pull it out to see what your mouth was all about. And then he started to describe, they were working with farm equipment, and sometimes you get broken bones and you get your arm mangled in a machine, and sometimes you had to have things amputated, and here are the tools to do it with. Well, the kid just flat out fainted, and he was so embarrassed. Okay, so this, I think, well, that was the cotton gin. This was a huge undertaking. This is Continental Cotton Gin. The cotton gin, that's not the original building for the cotton gin. The cotton gin, actually, this is built by the Continental Cotton Gin Company, which up until the last decade or so was producing cotton gins in Prattville. And this particular gin was manufactured in the 1900s. And it comes from Teasley's Mill, and I believe the owner of it, it stopped production in 1942, and it could have been because of the war, or they just couldn't find enough help to produce. But in 1978, the owner decided the building was so decayed and dilapidated that he wanted to get rid of it, and he wanted to disassemble all the mechanical parts. But because the gin had never been modernized, it was a gin from the 1900s, our antennas went up thinking this is a great relic that we should do something with. And thank goodness that 2 longtime cotton farmers and gin operators, Billy McLemore and Tommy Oliver. Tommy Oliver and Billy McLemore took it upon themselves to take this gin apart. And they stored it until landmarks could get the land or the funds together to restore it. In the late 1980s, we did have our act together. The land was purchased, and truckloads of metal parts and belts and wooden boards showed up. And from what I understand, people were going, how in the world is this going to be a cotton gin? But Tommy Oliver persevered, and he worked together with an architect to come up with the gin house. That it's housed in. Yeah, I do.
The ones that you really want to show. Because it's not staying very long.
Okay. So the cotton gin was put back together, and we opened the cotton gin in time for the bicentennial of the Eli Whitney gin, and that was in November of 1993. So how do we keep up with all these properties? You know, besides the buildings, we have the artifacts that go in them. We have the furnishings that go in them. We have lots of photographs that people in the community have given us that tell about the history of Montgomery. We have a reference library with over 1,600 volumes in it. There's a lot going on there that we have to keep up and maintain, and people we have to employ, but how do we do that? And the first way we do that is with 19 of the properties that we own. We lease out commercially to nonprofits or to small organizations. My husband is in one of them, Alabama Appleseed, and that gives us a great deal of our revenue. The city actually owns 95% of the buildings, but we have a contract with them where we maintain the buildings and they let us keep the rent from the leased properties. And while this does not cover very much of what we have going on there, it does help us. It's our largest producer. Okay, so these are archives and such. All right, so here's the road, mostly along Hull Street is where the commercial properties are. And as a matter of fact, we have 3 available this very minute. That's kind of unusual to have 3, but if you're interested or know someone who might be, just let me know. It's also on the website, but I'll be glad to talk to anybody. The other way income producer for us are the children who come through on their school groups. We tour them through with a role player and a guide, and our buildings there match perfectly with the 4th grade history curriculum. So as Jimmy said, we have about 35,000 kids that come through every year. We also have self-guided tours where families will come in and tour around, and you'd be quite surprised to see the number of people who register that are outside of the United States on any given week outnumber Alabamians who come through Old Alabama Town. We also have a thriving museum store, which has been a great source of income for us. We also have lots of programs that we put on. Some of them are free to the community, but some of them are ticketed events. As you may know, Marion and Neely or Jeff Benton, they're tromping on the pavement up and down downtown or in the graveyards giving tours. We have seminars on Alabama history, and we have our annual spring tour of Columbus. We also have a fabulous membership, and I think a lot of y'all are members here. I know every other person is a member. But our membership is commercial member, corporate members as well as individual members. And I have some membership cards here. We also have Rescued Relics, which is a little bit of a hidden treasure. It's an architectural salvage store. Let me back up now that we've got it. 2 years ago, we opened the Ware Farley Hood House, which is a beautiful 2-story home that we rent out for special events. If you haven't been there, I hope you're invited there soon or have your next event there. The day, look, there's Ellie Poole. Ellie is right there. She's dressed up in period clothing to host the people who are coming for the Daddy-Daughter Diamond Princess Ball. And Tavern Fest is one of our largest fundraisers as well. Rescued Relics, this is our architectural salvage. We look to people in the community to donate old windows and doors, fixtures, doorknobs, anything that really recycles some of the architectural elements of the past, and we sell them and keep the money. So, Landmarks oversees Old Alabama.